I just don't have time for a read aloud. Does it sound like you? I know, it used to be me too. But then I figured out a way to make sure that I read aloud to my students every day in the classroom. Come check out some of those ways with me. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to chat about how you can intentionally use read-alouds in your classroom so that you are making time for them every single day. When I first started teaching, I would just grab a random book off the shelf and that would be my read-aloud for the day. It wasn't the best plan. It often got bumped when we ran out of time because as teachers, we know that always happens. But like you, that read aloud always got bumped, and it's so important to read aloud to our students every single day. It has such a positive effect not only on their reading but on all of their learning in general. So today I want to share with you what I used to do, the changes that I made when it came to read alouds, and the results that I saw in my classroom after I started implementing some of these things. I hope that you will be able to do some of these things as well too. So like I mentioned, I used to just grab whatever book was on the shelf and that was my read aloud for the day if we had some extra time. Maybe the math lesson finished early one day and we had about 5 extra minutes. Didn't happen very often, but when it did, that's when the read aloud came out. Or maybe I would do it during snack time once in a while, but I was not consistent with it, didn't have a purpose for it, and it was just whenever I had extra time. My students really weren't invested in the read aloud as a result of this. They didn't necessarily look forward to it. They enjoyed it when we were reading, but they weren't invested in it. They weren't looking forward to it. And even though I had a passion for reading, it wasn't shining through to them. It got easy to skip because I really didn't have a plan for it. So it was that one thing that just got swept to the side when the science experiment went too long or there was an interruption in the classroom. The read aloud was the one thing that got pushed to the side. But I made some changes. So I quickly realized that because my read-alouds were not intentional, they were being swept to the side and I needed to make a change. So this is how I started. I looked through my planner to find out where I could fit in the read aloud every day because I knew I needed to be consistent and that we needed to do the read aloud every single day in order for it to be as effective as it possibly could. I looked for different times where we had a short break, where there was a transition time where we could squeeze that book in. Some years it was during snack time, sometimes it was right after recess or right before morning meeting. Every year was different in my schedule, but I wanted to make sure that almost every day it was at a consistent time so that my students knew when to expect that read aloud, when to look forward to the read aloud. Once I had a time and place for when the read aloud would happen, I made sure that all of my books were ready to go. So I often did my planning the Thursday before the following week so that I could get everything ready. On that day, I would also pick the read alouds that I wanted to do for the next week. If I had those books ready, it guaranteed that I would get to the read aloud. If I had that stack of books sitting right near my read aloud space, I had quick access to them and I could pick them up easily when it was time to read them aloud. So on Thursday, I would pick 5 books that I wanted to read for the next week. Maybe they connected to the curriculum, maybe they addressed some behaviors that I was seeing in the classroom, maybe it was a seasonal book, maybe it was just a book that I knew my students would love. I made sure I got all 5 of those books, whether I pulled them out of my classroom library, or I borrowed them from a colleague, or I got them from the local library. I have a video on how to get books for your classroom library, so feel free to check that out if you're looking for places to get books for your classroom for cheap. I would make sure that I had all of these books ready to go. I had a stack of all 5 of them. I didn't necessarily plan which days I would read them on, but I had 5 for 5 days of the week. They sat in a pile. I would put them right next to my easel, which is where I would do my read aloud. Did have to make sure that I hid them a little bit because my students would see them and they would try to take them for their own book bags. So I had to make sure the kids couldn't see them ahead of time. But having a read aloud time set in place, written down in my planner, making sure that I had those few extra minutes every day, and having the books ready and an easy place to access really ensured that I got a read aloud in every single day with my students. And if you're interested in a video on how to choose read alouds for your classroom, leave me a comment below that just says books, and I will make sure that I film another video for you guys all about that, because I think that could be really helpful for you in planning read alouds for the classroom. Another thing that I did that really built the momentum of the read alouds in the classroom is I started tracking the read alouds that we did, because, and this happened in my second grade classroom, I pulled a book off the shelf and the kid said, we read that already. I said, ooh, you're right, we did. And we talked about how we often read books more than once and we can enjoy them different ways as when we read them over and over. But I was a little embarrassed that we had already read it and I didn't realize we had. I started tracking books, 1, so I knew what we had read, and 2, so the kids knew what we read. There were different ways that I tracked them depending on which classroom I was in at the time and the size of my classroom and the layout of the classroom. One year, I had a bulletin board. I would post the covers of all the books that we had read on the bulletin board. This was an awesome reference for students because they could go up to the board and they could see the books that we enjoyed together as a class, and that helped them choose stories when they were book shopping in our classroom library. They could look at it and say, oh, I remember, I really liked that one, and they would put it in their book bag. Another way I did it, there was one year that I had a much smaller classroom and I didn't have as much bulletin board space, so I kept a binder. I did it 2 different ways. I either just wrote down the titles, that was helpful for my older students, and then for younger students, I liked having that visual. So again, I would put the image of the cover of the book in the binder and students could flip through it. We kept this binder in the classroom library. I really liked the bulletin board idea better, but you have to adapt to whatever your classroom looks like, right? So as a result of all these changes that I made, my students were more invested in the read aloud than ever. They were begging for the read aloud every day. They looked forward to it. They wanted to know what we were going to read next. And not only did they look forward to the read aloud, they looked forward to reading their own books. They wanted to be the first one to add our read aloud book to their book bag the next day. They wanted to read more books by the same author. They wanted to read more books in that genre. They were excited to talk about books with me. They were excited to recommend books to me. And this made a huge difference in my classroom. In addition, it saved me a lot of time. If I was planning for a read aloud, I could plan to connect it to what we were talking about in science or in social studies. And it really brought everything together, helped my students grasp concepts more than when I was just reading whatever book I pulled off the shelf. And because my students were begging for more, they were so much more engaged in the read aloud. They knew what to expect. They knew when the read aloud was coming. They knew the behaviors that were expected during that time. They really looked forward to it. I hope that you found these tips for making time for a read aloud in the classroom helpful. If you did, give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to my channel below because I will be back next Sunday night with more reading tips and tricks for you. Have a great week.